Hey guys, my name is Jeff, and today we're going to look at 5 verses that are often misused and taken out of context. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at how they're misused, and then we'll put them back in their proper context and see what they actually mean. And I would encourage you to stick around to the end, because at the end, we're going to look at an important lesson that will help us not take the Bible out of context anymore. Now, before we dive into these verses, would you just take a few seconds to like this video and then also subscribe to this channel so that you can stay up to date on content that's coming out? And also, leave a comment and let me know what topics you would like me to cover in future videos. All right, let's jump in. The first verse that I hear often misquoted and misused is Matthew 7:1, which says this: "Judge not, lest you be judged." This verse has become an extremely popular saying that many people use to say, don't judge me for what I'm doing, you just live your own life. And for many, people believe this verse is telling them that we shouldn't point out the sins or the faults in those around us. But the problem is, if that's what this verse meant, if that's what Jesus meant when he said this, he didn't practice what he preached, because he regularly went around to people and pointed out their sins and pointed out their faults. You see, we have the wrong idea of what Jesus meant when he said, judge not. What he meant was we shouldn't condemn others, but we should help others see the sin and the faults in their life. You see, just a few verses later, Jesus said that we should remove the log from our eye before we help them remove the speck from their eye. In other words, what Jesus is saying, he's saying we should deal with our sin, we should deal with our faults so that we can help others deal with theirs. We should point out the faults and the sin that we see in other Christians' lives. Why? To help them, not to condemn them. We shouldn't point the finger at them. Instead, in love, we should go to them and help them see the sin in their life. But we can only do that well when we deal with what's going on inside of us first. That's what it means to judge not. If you want a little bit more information on this verse and what it means in more detail, I've written a blog post about it that's linked in the description below, and you can get a greater understanding of what this verse is communicating. The second verse that's often misquoted and taken out of context is Philippians 4:13, which says, "I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength." This verse is often used as personal motivation to get through something tough, whether it be the rallying cry at the sports game, or getting through that test that you didn't study for, or dealing with a breakup, or whatever difficulty that you're facing in life. Often this verse is pulled out of context to use as personal motivation to get through whatever is in front of you. But that's not what Paul had in mind when he wrote this verse. If you just read the verses before and after it, what you'll find is Paul actually wrote this sitting in prison. And what he's communicating to us is that he's learned the secret to being content, whether he's sitting in his home or whether he's sitting in prison, whether he's eating a steak by the Mediterranean or whether he's eating gruel in a prison cell. He's learned the secret to be content, whether he has a lot or a little. And he can do all things through Christ who gives him strength. You see, this is Paul's motivation to get through what God had placed in front of him. This wasn't the motivation to go win that sports game. No, this was something much deeper. You see, the difficulties that we faced in this life, what Paul is telling us through this verse is that we can get through it because we have Christ in us. And we often cheapen this verse by reading it before we go out on the basketball court or the football field. But really what Paul is trying to communicate is so much deeper and so much richer. The third verse that's often misquoted and taken out of context is Jeremiah 29:11, which says this: "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." Often this verse is used as kind of a personal promise that God has plans to prosper us, that when we're facing trials or difficulties, that not only will God lead us through it, but there will be prosperity on the other side of it. And the issue that comes in when we read this verse is that we often think this verse applies to this life, that if we trust God, if we just follow him, then we will prosper in this life. But when we look at the context of this verse, we see that this was actually written to the Israelites who are living in captivity in Babylon. And they were living as captives, and what God was telling them just a few verses before was that they had another 70 years to live in captivity. In other words, the people hearing this verse were going to die as slaves. And God was telling them, don't worry, my plans for you are to prosper you, even if that won't be in this life. You see, Jeremiah 29:11 isn't the promise that our life here on this earth will be easy, that we'll have everything that we want, that we'll live in big houses and have lots of money. No, that's not the promise of Jeremiah 29:11. You see, this verse was meant to be encouragement to the nation of Israel that even though the rest of their life wasn't going to pan out as they thought, that God was still in control and they just needed to believe. And that's faith, isn't it? It's believing in advance what will only make sense in reverse. You see, Jeremiah 29:11 isn't a personal promise that you will have everything you want. Instead, it's a promise that for all who trust God, at the end of the day, at the end of our lives, that God is still in control and things will work out. If you want more information on the incredible message of Jeremiah 29:11 and what it means for us today, I've done an entire video on that verse, and you can find that in the description below, and also click on the thing that's above me and you'll be able to learn more about what this verse means for us today. All right, the next verse that's often misquoted and taken out of context is Revelation 3:20, which says this: "Behold, I stand at the door and knock, and if anyone hears my voice and lets me in, I will come in and eat with that person, and they with me." When we read this verse, we often picture Jesus standing on the outside of a non-believer's heart. But when we look at this verse in context, when we read a few verses prior, what we see is that this is actually Jesus standing on the outside of a Christian, a believer's heart, asking to come in. You see, this passage isn't addressed to a non-believer, it's addressed to Christians. More specifically, it's addressed to a church. When we look at the rest of Revelation 3, what we see is this passage is addressed to a church that thought they had it all together and they thought they were self-sufficient, that they could provide everything that they needed. But in the process, they became lukewarm and they'd left Jesus on the outside. And Revelation 3:20 is an invitation to let Jesus back in. You see, in this verse, Jesus isn't asking to come into the heart of a non-believer. He's asking to come back in to the heart of a Christian who's pushed him out and left him on the outside. If you want to learn more about this incredible verse and what it means for us today, I've done an entire video that's, again, linked in the description below, or you can click on the thing right up there. The fifth verse that's often misquoted and taken out of context is Matthew 18:20, which says this: "For where two or more are gathered in my name, there I am with them." This verse is one of the most misquoted verses that I hear all the time. It's often read at a church service or a prayer meeting to say that because two or more people are there, that God is there with them. But that totally ignores the context in which this verse is written. This verse is not talking about the presence of God in small gatherings of people. This verse is talking about church discipline. And if you were to back up just a few verses, you would see that Jesus is giving some really practical advice on how to handle conflict that we face among Christian brothers and sisters. And it's advice that we should really lean in on because it's really solid and practical advice. But instead, what we often do is we just pull this one verse out and say, because there's two of us, God is with us. But the reality is God is everywhere, whether it's a group of 2 or 200, or maybe you're just sitting all alone in your room. God is there with you. You see, this verse isn't talking about God's presence with us in small gatherings. The reality is God's presence is with us whether we're all alone or whether we're in a large group. God is always with us. What Matthew 18:20 is talking about is how to deal with conflict in a healthy way. If you want to learn more about Matthew 18:20 and what it means for us today, I've done a video that's linked in the description below, or click on the banner above me and you can learn more about what this verse means and how it applies to your life. Here's the point that I'm trying to make in this video, the lesson that I think we shouldn't ignore, and that is that context is really, really important. In fact, I would say that context is king. If you remember nothing else from this video, remember this: context matters. And when you read the Bible, don't just pull one verse out of context. Instead, read a few verses before, read a few verses after, so that you can understand what the Bible is trying to communicate to you. You see, when we ignore the context in which the Bible's written, we can quite literally make it say anything that we want. And when we open the Bible up, we need to slow down. And we need to look at the verses before and the verses after and pay attention to the context so that we pull out the right meaning of Scripture and not use and abuse the Bible and twist it to say something that it doesn't intend to say. Remember, context is king. If you want to learn more about how to read the Bible properly, I've done a video that will give you 5 practical and simple tips that you can take that will help you not only read the Bible in context, but also get more out of the Bible and experience the life-changing impact that the Bible can have on your life. That's linked in the description below, or just click right above me and you can go start learning about how to read the Bible properly. Thanks for watching. I hope that you learned something and that this video helped you rethink parts of your life and your faith. If it did, would you subscribe to this channel and then also leave a comment on this video and let me know what verse you would add to this list. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.